Okay, I'm back. We're talking about edge failures. Again, when you're trying to hit on stuff right at the center line, the imaginary center line, this is looking across the broken end of a biface, lenticular biface. You know, as far as not breaking stuff, if you're hitting down on this and this thing is right at the midline and you're not supporting good underneath here with a finger right under there and counteracting that downward force and making it run, you're probably going to break that piece. You're probably going to fold it. It should still be thick, and you should have already thinned your ends, and you should be counteracting that downward force, and you should have a reason for doing that downward force. When you see me doing it, usually what it means is, it could mean I'm just being lazy, but what it usually means is I started out with a fairly thick or fairly narrow piece, and I don't want to waste a lot of edge by constantly turning the edge back and forth and waste my width. And I want to play the ball where it lies for some reason. So I set it up to do that, and I can make the things easily run past the center line based on, you know, just my experience and practice with doing it with the support. But the other thing is, what you haven't seen me do nearly enough, and another thing that Jason does a lot on his stuff is he isolates everything. Marty isolates pretty much everything. The thing about isolating stuff is, number one, it makes it go easier, but number two, it protects your biface as your biface gets thinner and thinner. It protects your biface against transmitting a lot of shock to the biface itself as opposed to just initiating the flake and taking the flake. At any rate, so if you don't want to deal with that issue, get this stuff away from the center line. You know, have it be more like this, where you're hitting is below the center line, maybe halfway between the center line and the face if you want a thick flake, or down towards the low end of that if you want a thin flake. But again, the failures. What happens is when you run a set, like, okay, so you set up a continuous platform, you run a set all the way along it. What you end up with is, you end up with after you take that set, you get the bulbs of percussion here. And the bulbs of percussion create a concavity on the bottom side. And you've got deltas in between those concavities, but you've got a whole bunch of rolled edge concavity type thing on the bottom side. So you come and you tap down on that, or you braid down on that, or whatever, and trim off and get back your lenticular shape before you do the next set. If you don't do that properly, it's going to fail in there. So that causes a lot of edge failures. The point is, if you don't get your edge set up right and properly abraded, and if necessary, your platform's isolated, and then you hit them too hard, like some people I've seen have almost a one-size-fits-all swing, where they swing the same strength, and the energy is more than it needs to be, and it's always the same. So on every flake they take, they're putting too much energy into the edge. Basically, the energy you put into the edge should be the right amount to take exactly the flake you want. Anything else is just risky for no reason. So, you know, if you're hit a great overshot and you've got a perfectly flat support on it to where it doesn't take the back edge off, it doesn't hurt anything, but you swung too hard, you still put it at risk by putting a lot more energy onto that edge than was required to do what you wanted to do. And you're like, well, how do I keep from doing that? Practice. It has to be observant practice. You have to recognize, okay, that flake I just took, it did what I wanted, but did I need to hit it as hard as I did? Did I need to hit it as fast as I did? Could I have stepped up? You know, I know exactly what I can do with the different tools I use. So if I use this versus that, I know the difference before I use them. I know which one to grab. I know why I'm grabbing it. And it's based on previous results. And that's one of the frustrating things is like, you know, people say, I got an hour, teach me to nap. It takes thousands of hours. You know, you really want to be kind of huge rock pile, OCD, nothing else to do kind of guy or gal, if you want to be really good, and you have to have artistic talent. Bye. Wifey is leaving, so you're going to hear her Lambo crank here in a second. I said it in a second. What's she doing? Oh, there it goes. Yeah, I've got that Lambo tuned so well that it sounds almost like a RAV4. All right, I'm talking fast. The reason I'm talking fast is because I want to cover a bunch of crap before you get bored and turn me off. Here's the thing, though. Back to the issue of what you hit it with and how hard and how fast. When you create this, that is a problem. And a lot of nappers create that every single flake they take. Somebody asked me to talk about replication before. I'm not going to talk about replication. But I'm going to tell you, when people say something looks coppery, they don't know what they're talking about. Nothing looks coppery. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, copper isn't what causes that. What causes that is, in part, the hardness of the percussor, which can be anything hard. You know, rock is hard. Steel is hard. You know, lots of stuff is hard. So it can be anything hard, anything light, and anything fast. So, or anything sharp. Basically, what you're talking about when you talk about conchoidal fracture is you're talking about a force vector cutting through, causing a crack, and the crack propagates. The force vector is distorted by the degree to which a huge energy load is put on that edge real fast and real hard. At first, it's almost like people talk about hydrostatic shock, which is kind of a bad analogy, but at any rate, if you shoot a gelatin block with a very high powered or a very high feet per second lightweight bullet from a rifle versus you know, a slower thing from a pistol, you get all this distortion at first, and then just a straight line. It's the same thing with the cracks in there. If you go harder and faster and lighter with a percussor, you will get more bulb. As far as pressure work, if you take a hard, sharp pressure point and make a really strong edge unisolated and push hard on it, you'll get a bigger bulb of pressure. So, I'm not going to talk about why this doesn't look like the old boys do stuff, because they didn't do stuff the same way that a lot of people do stuff now. But what I will say is, this is a mechanical structural problem to be overcome in good napping. And the reason is, if I'm going to take me a little narrow rock, I'm going to take a rock like this, and I want to make the biggest point, the nicest point possible out of it. I can't screw up much. I can't waste a lot. I've got a square edge here, I've got to get rid of that. I've got cortex, I have to get rid of that. I do not have a lot of length and a lot of width. So every time I do something like this, it's a problem, because I rob myself of a substantial portion of my width that I need to use, rather than just bevel off and get rid of, trying to get it back to where it's normal enough where I can do a next set without messing up and having it fail. So, again, things you can do. You see me grinding on edges a lot. You see me making fairly stout edges. Well, the devil's in the details with how you do that, and it's a combination of all the factors, but the degree to which you have a continuous platform and no isolations ups the odds of that. The degree to which you over grind it and get it way too strong for the flake you're trying to take with the tool you're trying to take adds to that. The degree to which your tool is sharp, light, and fast adds to that. The degree to which you go conchoidal with your angle, like, you know, if you're coming down at an angle to where the conchoidal fracture will come straight off into the rock, that puts a lot more of the force initially high inward here than if you went downward on a supported edge and do a peeling initiation, which avoids this issue almost altogether. So a lot of the flakes you see me take, that's one of the reasons why, because it also keeps them from failing. When you take a fairly tough rock and you got a continuous platform, well, you need a fairly strong edge so it to stand up long enough to get the force into it to take your flake. But then if you put it in at that angle, you're putting in quite a bit of force and it tends to blow up that bulb, and a lot of times it'll break off here before it can roll out and run straight. So again, what I tend to do is support strongly underneath, support the back edge well, support strongly underneath and hit downward, and just translate it till I don't get the big bulb at any rate. So there's all that. So let's talk about breaking stuff again, and then I'll hit a rock. I know you're probably going crazy with the fact, oh, I want to see him hit a rock. I didn't want to hear him just talk. Well, sorry. People will say stuff like, yeah, I got my biface thin and nice, and I had all this time in it, and it was big and long, and it was great, and I was just about to make my sword that I have always wanted to make, and then I took a flake off the end and broke it. And my question is, okay, so why were you taking flakes off the end when the thing was already thinned and it's a long piece? You know, again, the first thing is you don't have to pull off magnificent feats of miraculous knapping if you never get in trouble and don't set things up for failure in the first place. So people say, well, what do I do about bad hinges? Don't make them, is the first answer. Now, you get over time with your skill level where you get it good at getting out of trouble. But it's somewhat of a misnomer. I've heard people say that, well, the difference between a good napper and a bad napper is a good napper is just better getting out of trouble. No, that's not totally true. The good napper gets in way, way, way less trouble for any given rock and situation. And then, yeah, they're good at getting out of stuff, but they're also good at not getting into stuff. Because, again, the difference a lot of times between a really expert napper and one that isn't is the really expert napper knows exactly what's fixing to happen when he takes a flake in many instances where the other person isn't as certain. An interesting analogy for me is where I become somewhat of a beginner in a way is when I scale things to a level that I'm not familiar with. So all I have to do is go get a much bigger rock than I ever work, and all of a sudden I'm kind of new, because when I'm trying to set up my edges, when I'm trying to take my strikes and everything, I haven't done it enough to know to predict exactly and accurately the result. So yes, I do have previous experience on a smaller scale that biases things in my favor with my predictions, but it's still, I don't just instinctively, my hands just don't know what to do, that it's going to be fine and I can think about something else while I'm working. The same holds true on different materials. You give me a rock I'd never worked before, And there's gonna be more smoke coming out of my ears than if I'm busy talking about the weather, working stuff I'm used to. If you give me a piece of pedernal amoeba, you know, I don't have to think. We can talk while I'm working. But, you know, if you give me something from a part of the country I've never seen before, never worked before, whatever, then I have to, until I figure out if it happens to work exactly like something I've worked a lot of, that's one thing. But if it doesn't, that's one of the reasons I ask people, hey, you know, try and get yourself a diverse rock pile as well as a big one. And anyway, but not breaking stuff. Okay, look. One of the things that I've been doing a lot lately when I'm working, I've been working wide or thick stuff that's kind of narrow. That's a problem. And what I've been doing a lot of is putting fairly strong pressure on the surface when I take the flake to sink it big time. And I know that I'm gonna hinge a lot of that. If you put too hard a pressure, then your flake will sink enough away from the pressure that it might get closer to this side than that side. And if that's the case and it still has much energy left, you're going to break the piece, because what it'll do is it'll just dive toward the path of least resistance, which becomes this side, and you'll end up. Of course, if you're also putting pressure here and there while you're putting pressure there, you're putting bending forces on it, which is a bad thing. You don't want to be doing this number. But at any rate, what you also do not want to do is you do not want to overstrike and catch too much of it when it isn't carefully supported. But along those same lines, when you come down, here's what everybody ought to do. If you got a phone that'll do slow-mo, set your phone up and video yourself taking some of your normal strikes and watch what's happening with your biface. It should be locked in the back of your hand, locked onto your leg, and supported in such a manner all along it and underneath here to where when you tap it hard, nothing happens. And then when you take your strike, there should be no anticipation of the strike with this hand. This hand is locked. This one's moving, but there should be no anticipation. If you, now I say that, there are a few expert guys that are like guided, you know, missile things where they've got everything in motion and working in the air and it all works for them. But most people can't do that. So what you should see is you should see none of this coming up, rolling as you're coming down, but also when you strike, you should not see your biface do this number. Your flake should initiate before the load is put on your biface, and you should not be seeing a big roll. If so, then if you're getting short flakes that don't go very far, that's why. All right, I guess I've talked enough for one thing about certain things, so I'll be right back and I guess I'll hit this rock for some reason. Right back.